By September of 1939, the Zero fighter was a proven combat airplane, and its pilots had demonstrated their superiority over the best of the enemy's fighters in China. The one-sided combat box scores attested dramatically to that fact. During this same month, the Navy prepared for its great mass production program and discussed with the Nakajima Airplane Corporation its role as the producer of the Mitsubishi-designed Zero fighter. Late in September, representatives from the Navy and the two companies drew up the final manufacturing agreements, and Mitsubishi's director of design transferred to Nakajima the blueprints necessary to initiate the new production program. The two companies agreed further to exchange all data required for future fabrication techniques and modifications. The conference ended with the understanding that Nakajima would bear the greatest portion of Zero production, and that Mitsubishi would engage in design alteration, as well as in production in parallel, with the proviso that Nakajima be kept fully informed of all changes. Eventually, Nakajima produced more than half, 6,500, out of slightly more than 10,400 planes, of all Zero combat models built, including the roof seaplanes modified from the fighter. In June of 1944, the Navy ordered the Hitachi Corporation to prepare the industrial facilities needed to manufacture Zero fighters. The Hitachi program failed eventually to produce any fighters because of materials shortages and air raids. Despite the tremendous production effort, the Zero fighter failed to meet the Navy's fighter plane requirements. This failure extended beyond the superiority later achieved by American fighters. The more than 10,000 fighters produced could not meet even the numerical demands of the Navy. Behind this failure lay the obvious reasons of a shortage in engineers, lack of sufficient skilled workers, lack of materials, and so on. But apart from these, other factors hampered our production activities. Jiro Horikoshi fills in the rest of the picture. Soon after its introduction to combat, we cut back the production of the Raiden Interceptor plane. Despite our plans that this fighter should replace the Zero, it suffered from poor pilot visibility and lacked the flight endurance necessary for Pacific operations. We invested our greatest hopes in the Reppu carrier-based fighter, the performance of which might well return to Japan its lost air superiority in carrier versus carrier combat. The Reppu, true to my predictions of several years back, disappointed the Navy with poor performance caused by the difficulties and power loss associated with the production-type Homar engine. Even frantic efforts to mass produce the Shiden Mod Interceptor were fruitless, as an endless stream of last-minute design changes and disorderly arranged blueprints drove the final production line crazy. As the confusion and bickering mounted to a crescendo, the Allies continued to increase their superiority in the air. The Navy had little choice but to depend upon the Zero as its major frontline airplane until the war's end. Throughout the war, Mitsubishi was responsible for the improvements and modifications to the Zero fighter, many of which were based upon frontline reports from our pilots. So frequently did the Navy forward these rushes orders for modifications that it became impossible to maintain a steady production flow. Mitsubishi suffered especially from the Navy's inability to crystallize its decisions regarding the Zero and Raiden fighters. We would receive orders to boost the output of the Zeros, with the Raiden taking second priority. A month later, the Navy would reverse its order, and engineers would try frantically to unravel their new setups. 3 months later, perhaps, a new change in policy would come through. It became an incredible seesaw game between the two fighters. Nakajima did not suffer from such frequent changes, and, freed of the time-consuming necessity for changing assembly lines, maintained an average monthly production rate of over 200 planes from the fall of 1943 to the spring of 1945. Their peak was 270 planes in March of 1944. The average monthly production during the same period for Mitsubishi, however, was barely over 100 planes, with a peak of 155 reached in October of 1944. Mitsubishi suffered not only from the policy tantrums of the Navy, but, early in December of 1944, with the war nearing the critical stage, reeled from the shock of a severe earthquake, Tokai District earthquake, which rocked the city of Nagoya and its southeastern suburbs. The earthquake was only the beginning of a series of incredible misfortunes to befall the aircraft industry. The Nagoya Aircraft Works of the Mitsubishi Company, a giant airframe production center, was built over a weak ground foundation of reclaimed land east of Nagoya Harbor. The quake so severely jolted the factory that gaping cracks and strains developed in the concrete floors. Every assembly jig was thrown out of line, and several of the important shop buildings on separate ground collapsed. Thus, in a single blow, the production of both Mitsubishi's and Aichi's giant planes ground to a halt. Both companies made frantic efforts to readjust the assembly jigs, working day and night to complete the job so that production could resume. Even as the plants returned slowly to normal operations, on December 13, 1944, B-29 bombers from Mariana Island bases ripped the Mitsubishi engine works at Daiko-cho, Nagoya, and 5 days later hurled their high-explosive and incendiary bombs at the aircraft works at Ohemachi, Nagoya. Up to the time of this heavy raid, the military authorities could not reach a final decision on the matter of plant dispersal. Torn between the vital need for more and more airplanes and the knowledge that the American bombings would increase in severity and effectiveness, they hedged continually on the matter. After the attacks against the Mitsubishi plants, however, the government ordered immediate plant dispersal, and Mitsubishi put into practice its long-standing plans. Its first move was to transfer the major part of its engineering division to the school buildings in Nagoya. The company separated its airframe production division into 3 separate units, 1 Navy and 2 Army, and dispersed these to widely scattered areas. Navy facilities went to Suzuka, Omi, Nagoya, Nankai, Hokuriku, and to Gakunan. Army installations were set up in Nagoya and its southeastern suburbs, and in Ofu, Nagano, Ueda, Gifu, Daimon, Toyama, and Kanazawa. These dispersed factory units remained within the central part of Honshu Island. The company rented spinning and textile factory buildings to house its scattered machinery. Finally, the engineering division, separated from the production units, transferred to a silk manufacturing building and to schools in Matsumoto in Nagano Prefecture. The hasty move concentrated Zero fighter production in the Suzuka and Omi districts. Following these initial activities, factory dispersals coincided with the mass evacuation of city residents to rural areas. This latter move found little favor with the people. They felt it was certain to bring the B-29S after them, even in the remote country districts. Even as the Mitsubishi Company began its complicated dispersal program, the B-29S returned. Again and again they showered bombs on Nagoya, with the result that traffic and communications became hopelessly entangled in a snarl of raging fires, blocked streets, and destroyed telephone lines. The well-laid dispersal plans went up in smoke with the flaming buildings. We found it impossible to maintain adequate communications among our scattered workshops. Production control vanished, and the manufacturing schedules became worthless scraps of paper. From March of 1945, Nagoya reeled beneath an unbelievable cascade of high explosives and incendiaries from the B-29 fleets. So effective was this aerial interdiction that, despite every effort, the Mitsubishi Company managed to produce during the entire month of July the ridiculously small total of only 15 fighter airplanes. Nagoya and Tokyo became the 2 most frequently bombed cities in Japan. The Americans choose their targets wisely, for the 2 cities were the most critical centers of the entire nation. Nagoya was Japan's aircraft manufacturing center. One great factory at Daiko-cho alone produced 40% of all our aircraft engines, and the sprawling plant at Ohemachi assembled 25% of our aircraft. Tokyo, of course, was our military and political center. The incessant raids rapidly disorganized internal functions, and government activities nearly reached a standstill. The Nakajima Company spread its airframe factories through the northern section of the Kanto province and, fortunately, escaped the brunt of the earlier enemy bombing attacks. Despite the dispersal program, which ruined manufacturing schedules, Nakajima produced 138 Zero fighters in June of 1945. All did not go well, however, with the great Nakajima firm. The company dispersed the critical engine plants, which produced the Zero's Sake power plant, to the Tokyo suburbs. The move failed to hide the factories from the B-29S, and the resulting torrent of bombs so severely shattered machinery and assembly lines that engine production dropped well behind the airframe program. In September of 1943, the sprawling airframe factory at Mizushima in Okayama Prefecture in western Honshu was separated from the Nagoya Aircraft Works. The former single combine now was broken into two separate manufacturing centers. In January of 1944, Mitsubishi again divided another large plant, this time the Kumamoto Aircraft Works in Kyushu's Kumamoto Prefecture. The former factory produced the Type 1 land-based attack bomber, Betty, for the Navy, and the latter turned out the Ki-67 bomber, Peggy, for the Army. Mitsubishi divorced the activities of the two factories from its primary concern, which was increased Zero fighter production. In February and March of 1945, the two plants dispersed throughout nearby suburban areas. They failed, however, to escape the B-29S, and by July their production lines were almost still. The fate of these vital aircraft factories, despite their high target priority to the enemy, was not at all different from that of other production centres. By May of 1945, munitions plants and the most important civilian goods factories were reduced to shattered remnants of once efficient industries. Many factories which went through the time-consuming steps of dispersing its most important machine and assembly lines now found themselves no better off than before dispersal. The B-29S relentlessly and literally tracked down every move. No sooner had the new factory sections settled down in their new locations than the bombs showered down. The plant managers searched frantically for new sites and sought refuge in factory buildings surrounded by steep mountains, or placed their vital machines within emergency caves drilled into the sides of hills. Eventually, the dispersal plan proved to be a complete failure. At the time when we most desperately needed production, our industrial personnel scrabbled in the hills for new machine sites. Devastation in Japan mounted daily, as the B-29S were joined in the daily assaults against the homeland by long-distance land-based fighters and swarms of carrier-based fighters and bombers. This loss of fighter plane production directly weakened our defensive tactics against the enemy fighters and bombers. This was especially applicable in the battle against the great fleets of four-engined B-29S. During the earliest superfortress attacks, our fighters inflicted heavy damage against the enemy planes. By May, we were so short of fighter airplanes that the B-29S, constantly increasing in number, roamed the skies almost at will. As a result of both the enemy air attacks and our own chaotic plant dispersal, our aircraft production dropped alarmingly, as indicated in the following tables. The peak of monthly airframe production for the Army was reached in July of 1944, with 1,331 aircraft completed, and for the Navy in November of 1944 with a total of 1,260 airplanes. Mitsubishi's aircraft engine production peak for the Army was reached in September of 1944 with 980 engines. 1 month previously, the company hit its Navy aircraft engine top with 961 units. These figures do not include those airframes produced by the Hitachi Aircraft Company, which manufactured a small percentage of Navy aircraft, or those of the Manchurian Airplane Manufacturing Company, which produced from 10 to 15% of all Army airframes. The severe production losses sustained in late 1944 greatly hindered our defense against the approaching enemy and our interception of the enemy fighters and bombers which ranged over Japan. The greatest causes for this sudden production failure were, of course, the severe damage inflicted by the B-29S and the effects of the Tokai district earthquake. By no means, however, were these the only two causes, for many other factors indirectly affected aircraft production even before the first B-29 raids against the homeland. Perhaps the greatest cause, other than the B-29 attacks and the Tokai earthquake, was the difficulty in obtaining certain types of critical materials, notably aviation gasoline. Once the enemy submarines, mine-laying planes, patrol bombers, carrier task forces, and surface warships had effectively sealed off the sea routes to the southern area of resources on which we depended, the end was in sight. This resource isolation of Japan, both directly and indirectly, contributed to our losing air superiority over the vital arterial route to the south. Eventually, enemy pressure through direct bombing and air attack became so severe that our air forces found themselves helpless against the activities of the American submarines and carrier-based planes, as well as against the B-29S. This paralysis of the sea routes upon which Japan depended for its very existence brought about the virtual isolation of the country. The air raid damage and the frantic reshuffling of supplies available directly within Japan threw our internal transportation facilities into chaos. The hindrance of transportation and the loss of raw materials reduced aircraft factory assembly lines to a meaningless crawl. Further, those aircraft which we did manage to produce under these difficulties were less effective than usual, for the inferior materials employed in their manufacture reduced flight performance and increased the time spent in maintenance and overhaul. Vital equipment failed all too often, and our pilots cursed the planes which consistently failed them, just as they attacked the great enemy air fleets. Before we could realize the confusion into which our aircraft production had descended, our industry had disintegrated to an extent where recovery seemed impossible. Not only were our raw materials cut off from the factories, but we struggled under the heartbreaking hardships of earthquakes, severe bombings, factory dispersal, and, later, of incompetent workers dragged off the streets through resort to the conscription laws. Even as the industry became lost in this sea of hopeless chaos, the military services demanded modifications in a steady stream. We could hardly produce even the basic model, to say nothing of altering partially completed planes. The trail of grief did not end here. As the limited number of airplanes came off the disorganized production lines, many of them remained on the ground, while the others were flown only on short and usually meaningless flights. There was a total lack of gasoline with which to fly these machines, except on the briefest flights. Even those airplanes flown on test hops were liable to encounter enemy fighters and bombers, which daily defied our weak air resistance and flew where they pleased. After the fall of the Mariana Islands to the enemy, the entire aircraft industry labored under the shadow of inevitable defeat. By May of 1945, several months before the capitulation of Japan, we despaired of ever increasing our production. Personal effort was now meaningless, for the factories were on the verge of collapse for lack of parts and materials. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki contributed absolutely nothing to this industrial disintegration. It was complete long before August 5 and 9, 1945. To their credit, the Navy's officers never ceased their attempts to obtain through qualitative gains what we no longer could hope to accomplish with our outnumbered planes. In the final months of the war, our engineers feverishly pushed the development of jet propulsion, rocket-powered guided missiles, rocket-powered interceptors, and similar projects. Japan started late in this work, and American engineers later considered our progress, in the face of a tardy beginning and ceaseless destruction of our planes, as amazing. The need for haste naturally resulted in the appearance of inherent technical defects in the new equipment. Given sufficient time, these defects would have been eliminated, and the new jet and rocket aircraft and missiles might have developed successfully. The time, of course, was not to be had. When the occupation forces came ashore on Japanese soil, the enemy's technical intelligence officers soon visited our research and development centers. They paid special attention to the Yokosuka Naval Air Research and Development Center, where we had conducted the bulk of our aeronautical engineering activities. The scene which greeted the American technicians was not one of which we were proud, for our leading research installation was by then a confused collection of thin-walled wooden and stucco buildings. Lack of repairs had allowed the green and brown camouflage paint to peel from the riddled aircraft hangars. Those airplanes still on the field were in terrible condition, desperately in need of maintenance. Many of the planes were scarred with bullet and cannon shell holes from the strafing of the American fighters. Equipment lay haphazardly on the ground, left by the disheartened engineers and crewmen. The surface picture did not tell the entire story, for much of our research work went on within the security of the Yokosuka limestone hills. In these subterranean chambers we had set up aircraft hangars, machine shops, assembly lines, storage facilities, and living quarters. The underground installations were actually complete experimental aircraft factories. Here, too, the misery and dissolution of a hopeless battle were evident, for the once efficient and neat workshops had given way to filth and uncertain routine. Our work had become disorganized, and as defeat became ever more inevitable, even haphazard. The loss of supplies, machine tools, and vitally needed materials meant that our technicians must obtain their precision parts through the use of hand benches and tools, and by painstakingly hammering out the thousands of small items of equipment which go into the modern airplane. This was the engineering and technical status of the Air Force, which only 4 years before had dominated more than 7,000 miles of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The urgent needs of the Combat Air Corps forced the Army and Navy to place in production several types of experimental aircraft, which lacked the required test flights and design modifications. Airplanes were rushed from the experimental hangars to the production line, with the result that the planes were dispatched to the front lines before we could determine the missions which they could most effectively perform. Our engineers lacked the time necessary to prepare maintenance manuals and texts. Thus, the front-line mechanics, plagued with primitive working conditions, were forced to service airplanes about which they understood little. The confusion of the maintenance crews inevitably caused equipment malfunction and breakage on a prohibitive scale. Typical of these planes were the Raiden, Shiden Kai, Ginga, Tojo, and the Type 4 fighter. Shortages in raw materials and aviation fuels contributed primarily to the final collapse of the aircraft industry. The items most in demand were aluminum and the alloy steels. The allocation of aluminum for aircraft production decreased from a 1942 figure of 6.5 tons per airplane to 5.3 tons in 1943 and, in 1944, to only 3.8 tons. By late 1944, the industry was slowing down because of the scarcity of alloy steels. The use of substitute materials for vital engine parts further slowed production, as our workers were forced to pay more attention to heat treatment, forging, and final assembly. We suffered a sudden increase in the failure of crankshafts, gears, and other critical engine parts. The inadequacies of the material mobilization plan made it impossible to alleviate the situation. Our natural crude oil resources, compared to our national requirements, are barely worth mention. Consequently, an extended war in which our sea routes were cut, as happened in 1944 and early 1945, could only mean critical fuel shortages. By July of 1944, we found ourselves severely handicapped by lack of aviation fuel. Pilot training was cut drastically, and commanding officers on the front were ordered to send their planes out on only the most essential missions. Engineers were forced to reduce the bench test time for new engines, and consequently ordered those same engines into production, even when they were plagued with operating difficulties. The best example was the Homare Ha-45 power plant used in several Navy and one Army combat plane. Despite their aerodynamic configurations and high power, constant engine trouble and long hours of maintenance consistently grounded the airplanes. Throughout the war, the aircraft industry laboured under the unrealistic demand that it manufacture an excessive number of production types, that it slow production in order to build numerous prototypes, and that it effect far too many modifications to aircraft already on the assembly lines. These military requirements severely overburdened the small group of competent engineers available to the industry. The endless attrition of engineering manpower eventually resulted in great confusion between the drafting rooms and the production line. The fundamental sources of the trouble were the Army and Navy. The two organizations lacked a fundamental understanding of the actual nature of engineering, and were given to making unreasonable demands. The engineers further aggravated the situation by failing to take a determined stand against these constant orders from military headquarters. Had they done so, many of their problems could have been obviated. Japan's generally low industrial capacity always proved detrimental to our attempts to realize mass production of precision equipment. Engine production, for example, never equaled the output of airframes, causing a surplus of the latter. Frankly, Japan did not meet the European technical standards of such basic industries as those which processed raw materials and produced the machined tools necessary for the aircraft factories. Another great fault was that our plant managers never mastered the techniques of controlling the sprawling aircraft plants. Naturally, the inefficiency which inevitably arose indirectly cost us many airframe and engine units. Management inadequacies were highlighted when war broke out, and the government called for a substantial increase in production. Not only did the major plants suffer from their own deficiencies, but they were forced to accept parts produced by subcontractors, which were clearly of inferior quality. These subcontractors were small machine shops scattered throughout the cities and towns. There did not exist a single criterion of quality for the thousands of small shops. As a result, the major plants were forced to destroy a great deal of the material received. The majority of our engineers were handicapped from the beginning of their design programs. Anxious to acquire the world's leading fighters and bombers, the military services issued performance specifications clearly beyond the capacity of our industry. Attempting to meet these unrealistic demands, engineers often overextended themselves and produced designs which, while admittedly modern, actually lay outside the realm of sound engineering. Impressed perhaps by the performance results of prototype aircraft, the government ordered new planes, engines, and equipment into mass production. We paid for our rashness in time, material, and energy, for the production machines had to be sent to modification centres for extensive alterations. Production likewise suffered as the engineers repeatedly modified their products to eliminate many of the technical bugs. Our industry never filled its minimum requirements for qualified technicians and skilled factory workers. This unhappy situation resulted from the nation's general low industrial standard. Furthermore, the aircraft factories could borrow from other industries only a handful of able technical personnel. In this respect, the military services seemed bent on increasing our difficulties for, except on rare occasions, they refused to consider individual cases in the conscription program, and we watched our experienced men drift away to war along with the unskilled labourers. Japan paid heavily for her failure scientifically to plan the location of aircraft factories, and by 1942 our airframe, engine, instrument and equipment factories had become concentrated in and around large cities. This failure to disperse enabled the enemy B-29S to perform their task of destruction with little difficulty in finding targets. The massed factories literally invited the rain of bombs. We paid heavily to prepare facilities in outlying areas when the government ordered plant dispersal, but not until we began to suffer heavy damage was the dispersal order given. We never managed to return our plants to normal operation after the air attacks commenced. An added crippling blow was the Tokai area earthquake in December of 1944. Not only were the great Mitsubishi and Aichi airframe plants paralyzed completely for at least a month, but they never fully overcame the effects of the devastating earthquakes. When Japanese ships and planes swept over more than 6,000 miles of the Pacific and Indian Oceans to launch the Pacific War, the government had a specific plan of defense for the homeland. We would capture every enemy airbase outpost within bombing range of Japan to deny the Americans or the British the installations from which to mount air attacks. Further, we would destroy the majority of enemy aircraft carriers so that their smaller planes would not be able to bomb our cities. It was chiefly for this reason that the Japanese Navy occupied Wake Island, Guam, and air bases in the Philippines and along the sea coast of China. Even the Pearl Harbor attack was planned to a great extent, with the defense of the Japanese mainland in mind. These early operations achieved their objectives, but only to a limited extent and for a limited period of time. We occupied every airbase we had intended to, but the Pearl Harbor attack failed to catch any of the American carriers we wished to sink. And on April 18, 1942, the first American planes flew over Tokyo in what was admittedly a raid, essentially for morale-boosting and propaganda purposes. Eventually, B-29 formations were to blacken our skies and reduce our cities to charred wreckage, but this still was far in the future. The details of the air attacks upon Japan, which culminated in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, are known to every Japanese and have been more than adequately described in the United States. There are certain aspects of this aerial strangulation, however, which have not previously been presented and are here made available. Some material appearing in these pages cannot, of course, be entirely unknown to the student of the Pacific War, but the air war against the Japanese mainland cannot be overemphasized, for its effects were beyond the comprehension of both the Japanese and the enemy. At the time of the Doolittle raid on Japan, one, Okumiya, was an air staff member of the 11th Combined Air Flotilla with headquarters at the Kasumigora Air Corps Base, approximately 25 miles northeast of Tokyo. I was able to witness part of the raid, watching a B-25 skimming low near our headquarters. We knew that something was up in the Pacific. Since April 10th, the wireless communications of the American Pacific Fleet indicated that a carrier task force might approach the Japanese mainland. It seemed that sometime after April 14th, the Americans would launch a carrier plane attack against the main island of Honshu. Admiral Yamamoto ordered immediate countermeasures. He alerted all the patrol vessels in the Pacific Ocean within 600 nautical miles of the mainland to make special daily patrols of the sea east of Japan and, at the same time, ordered all available Navy planes to assemble in the Tokyo area. At 6:30 a.m. on April 18th, Tokyo headquarters received a flash warning from our patrol boat, number 23 Nitomaru, which was on regular duty in the specified danger area. The boat's captain radioed that he had sighted 3 American aircraft carriers 600 nautical miles east of Inubo Point. We never heard from the ship after the first report. Obviously, the carrier escorts had destroyed the vessels. Several hours later, at 9:45 a.m., a Betty patrol bomber confirmed the existence of enemy planes in the area. It had sighted 2 enemy bombers between 500 and 600 nautical miles east of Tokyo. On the basis of the original patrol vessel report, the commander of the Yokosuka Naval Station and the Army commander of the Tokyo area issued an air raid warning at 8:30 a.m. Their respective fighter planes were ordered to be in the air by 12 noon. By the noon hour, 3 Type 96 Claude fighters from the Kasumigora Air Corps circled at 10,000 feet, and 2 other fighters waited at the airbase for takeoff orders. None of us at Kasumigora expected the enemy air attack before the late afternoon at the earliest, since the American carriers had only single-engine bombers. We could not know, of course, that Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle's 16 bombers aboard the Hornet would be fast, twin-engined North American B-25S, or that the attack had been planned so that the B-25S would leave the carriers 400 miles from Japan. The patrol vessel sighting forced the Americans to launch their planes 620 miles off the coast, which consequently meant they would arrive over their target several hours earlier than we expected. Actually, Doolittle's men left the Hornet 10 hours ahead of schedule. The enemy bombers flew toward Japan at a height of only 15 to 20 feet. At approximately 1 p.m. we received word that American planes, flying very fast, low and not in formation, were over the mainland. The enemy's tactics were superb. Their on-the-deck flight had completely fooled our air defense system, and the 3 fighters circling 10,000 feet over the flotilla base never even saw the B-25S. Since we were a primary training unit, we did not have available a single Zero fighter at any of the 4 bases around Kasumigara. When the B-25S bombed Tokyo, not a single anti-aircraft gun fired at the bombers, and not a single fighter plane went in pursuit. The 16 B-25S scattered their hits and struck at North, Central and South Tokyo, Kanagawa, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Kobe, Osaka and Nagoya. When the 16 B-25S attacked Honshu, the Navy had already completed its plans for the midway operation, but not without serious opposition from some high-level Navy quarters. The Doolittle attack served Yamamoto's needs in that the bombing thoroughly silenced the dissenting voices. Fortunately, the public was well aware that this type of sporadic air attack could not cause serious damage and was little disturbed. We understood, however, that the Americans had accomplished their primary purpose of boosting the morale of their own people, then apprehensive because of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the loss of so many islands and ships in the Pacific with this single raid. The Doolittle raid spurred plans to strengthen Japan's homeland defense against future bombings. Ever since the start of the war, homeland defense had been the Army's responsibility, with the Navy relegated strictly to cooperate with the Army at the latter's convenience. The April 18th attack brought forth a government order that henceforth both services would take every measure to create an effective air defense. Passive defense measures were considerable, but little actually was done to increase the number of fighters and interceptors for mainland patrol against bombers, which might not appear for long months or years. The disastrous plane losses incurred at Midway, the air battles at Guadalcanal, and the unexpected attrition of planes in the Solomons and Rabaul areas had steadily drained our available fighter strength. Neither the Army nor the Navy had anticipated such devastating defeats, and the requirements of the frontline forces dictated that every available fighter plane and anti-aircraft weapon originally assigned to homeland defense be shipped to the Pacific. In later months, with the war steadily approaching the home islands, the people called for increased defenses against impending enemy air attacks. We could do little to answer these pleas, for we desperately needed every plane along our shrinking defense lines. In the summer of 1943, we obtained for the first time accurate information concerning the new Boeing B-29 bomber, the Superfortress, which reputedly had a radius of action far in excess of that of the consolidated B-24 Liberator. On June 15, 1944, the B-29 appeared over the mainland for the first time. The Americans had opened the final battle for Japan. Between the evening of June 15th and the following morning, the same day when the Americans launched the beachhead operation to take Saipan, more than 45 B-29s flew over northern Kyushu from a staging base at Chengdu in China. Editor's note: 68 planes took off on the mission, 47 arrived in the Kyushu area, and 5 were lost because of operational mishaps. The planes attacked the steel center of Yawata, but the bombing was ineffective and only a small number of civilian structures suffered damage. Despite its lack of destructive results, however, the first Yawata attack had a grave psychological effect on the Japanese people. Where they regarded the Doolittle raid as a nuisance, the Yawata assault promised tremendous bombing raids in the future. All Japan discussed what might happen when the Americans increased the severity of their raids. The iron chain the enemy was closing on the homeland was becoming ever tighter. On July 8th and on August 11th and 20, the B-29s flew from their China mainland bases to attack our southern cities. Every bombing followed a certain pattern from which we could determine in advance of the attack how many planes would make the raids, when the attack would come, and other details of the missions. Because of this advance information, our mainland air defense forces were able to have their fighters in the air waiting for the bombers as they arrived for their bomb runs. Our first information came 2 to 3 days before the attacks. American transport planes increased their shuttle flights between a British airbase near Calcutta, India, and the B-29s held in China, ferrying gasoline and other materials for the big planes. Our Navy radio listening stations in Tokyo caught the details of every coded communication which, we determined, were from the American planes reporting the exact times of their arrivals and departures. These radio communications were so clear that we could calculate the exact number of planes flying the China missions. 2 or 3 days later, a similar number of B-29s would arrive over Japan. We never failed in these bombing forecasts, which received corroboration from Army and Navy units scattered widely in China. These reports were dispatched at once to Tokyo. Within 10 minutes, every anti-aircraft battery and every fighter base was informed of the estimated time of arrival of the American bombers. Despite the remarkable good fortune of anticipating enemy attacks in detail, our defenses proved ineffective. The superfortresses made their first 3 attacks during the night. We had few Navy fighters available for interception, and they proved of little value against the large and powerful enemy planes. Even the army found itself handicapped in night interception, and army fighters attacked only a limited number of planes. On the evening of August 20th, Navy fighters made our first effective interception. Approximately 60 B-29S attacked targets in Kyushu, Chugoku, and western Shikoku. Intercepting Navy fighters shot down one B-29 and damaged 3 others. Army fighters damaged several other bombers. These attacks were always extremely dangerous, for the B-29S carried the remarkable defensive armament of at least 12 heavy machine guns in power turrets. One of our night fighters under Lieutenant Endo demonstrated the effectiveness of the twin-engined night fighter Gecko, Irving, during this attack. An experienced night fighter team which had fought against B-17S and B-24S over the Solomons and Rabaul, Endo's crew shot down the B-29 we confirmed as destroyed. He brought his fighter plane directly beneath the tail of a B-29 over Sasebo and, flying almost with the bomber's speed, fired the 20mm cannon which was fixed in an oblique position behind the pilot's seat. The upward-firing cannon poured shells into the huge airplane, which burst into flames and fell from the sky. Several minutes later, Endo slipped beneath another superfortress and heavily damaged the airplane. Another Gecko fighter, piloted by one of Endo's men, repeated the maneuver and shot up a third B-29. Following the August 20th attack, the B-29S did not return to attack Japan proper until late October. 5 days before this last bombing raid, I was appointed as the Air Staff Officer, Japan Homeland Defense Navy Section, at Imperial General Headquarters. To my disappointment, I discovered that we had only 192 planes of all types assigned exclusively for air defense. Of these, the majority of the day fighters were Zeros, and the remainder, a small number of Raidens, Jacks, and Shidens, Georges. The night fighters were all Geckos. These fighters were distributed to 3 areas: 48 day and 24 night fighters to Yokosuka, 48 day and 12 night fighters to Kure, and 48 day and 12 night fighters to Sasebo. The Army had available for homeland defense some 200 planes of all types, and assigned 110 planes to Tokyo, 60 to North Kyushu, and 30 to Osaka. In addition to these planes, there were available in Japan nearly 400 additional Army and Navy fighter planes, assigned to such special missions as escorting bombers for attacks against enemy ships, but they cooperated with the Homeland Defense Force in special emergencies. On August 16th, 2 B-29S, which we believed were based at the new Saipan airfields, flew a reconnaissance mission over the Bonin Islands. On October 30th, there no longer was any doubt as to the use of Saipan as the B-29 base. 8 of the giant bombers attacked the naval base at Truk. At 1:30 p.m. on November 1st, the first B-29S appeared over Tokyo. Aircraft spotters were astonished suddenly to discover the 2 huge planes on a reconnaissance mission high over the city. They dropped no bombs and left shortly after their arrival, but their appearance was a great shock to the military personnel charged with the mainland defense. Until these planes were sighted directly over the city, we had no idea that the airplanes were over Japan. Our patrol planes and ships had failed to sight the bombers, and despite the excellent flying weather, our interceptors could not catch the enemy planes. Within the next 2 weeks, additional B-29S flew over Nagoya on reconnaissance missions, again with impunity. On November 24th, Saipan-based B-29S raided Tokyo for the first time. For approximately 3 hours during the afternoon, some 70 bombers attacked the Tokyo area, concentrating their missiles on the Musashino works of the Nakajima Airplane Company at Kichijoji, a vital engine factory. The bombing killed and injured 260 people and destroyed at least 100 civilian homes. These losses were immaterial. What mattered was that the B-29S had wrought tremendous destruction in the critical factory, causing a loss of more than 50% of normal production. 5 days later, the B-29S bombed Tokyo proper for the first time, setting great fires in the Kanda and Nihonbashi areas in the heart of the city. Some 2,500 homes were destroyed, 100 people died, and some 15,000 were made homeless. By now, every Japanese citizen realized that the American air attacks would cause devastation and misery on a scale they had never anticipated. The future was ominous. The first raids also made it evident that the B-29S would strike not at military establishments, but at strategic industrial plants and civilian homes. For the first time, our people knew the meaning of fear from air attack. The B-29S ranged across half of Asia, attacking factories and other targets in Manchuria, Korea, Formosa, and other areas. On October 25th, the bombers from China returned to the Kyushu area, and a total of at least 150 B-29S smashed most of the Navy's 21st Air Arsenal at Omura, 25 miles south of Sasebo. 70 fighters, including Zeros, Raidens, and Geckos, made intercepts, and our pilots reported they had either shot down or damaged at least 19 planes. The losses and damage sustained by the enemy were meaningless compared to the effect of their bombs. The B-29S had proven deadly opponents to our fighter planes in air combat, and the light losses sustained by these airplanes, as well as the terrible damage to our factories, prompted our pilots to discuss kamikaze attacks against the huge airplanes. On November 21st, Lieutenant Mikihiko Sakamoto dove his fighter into a B-29 over Sasebo, giving up his life to destroy the enemy bomber. The aerial death struggles continued steadily until early January of 1945, with the B-29S constantly increasing the severity of their attacks. We learned finally that the Americans had abandoned their China mainland bases to concentrate their attacks from Marianas installations. On December 13th, the Marianas-based superfortresses for the first time attacked the Great Nagoya Aero Engine Works, and 5 days later smashed at the Nagoya Aircraft Works. From late 1944 until early February of the following year, they repeatedly attacked the aircraft factories in the Nagoya area in daylight raids and, on night missions, bombed the civilian areas in Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, and Kobe. The B-29S made limited attacks against aircraft plants in the Kwanto and Kobe area. Our aircraft plants were smashed with wreckage, for the high explosive and incendiary bombs had shattered machinery, broken steel supports, burned out vast factory sections, and killed hundreds of workers. Mitsubishi's Nagoya aircraft and engine factories, Kawasaki's Akashi engine plant west of Kobe, and Nakajima's Ota aircraft factory 45 miles northwest of Tokyo all sustained great damage. Each of these factories were vital centers of airframe and engine production for both the Army and the Navy, and the B-29 attacks caused a drastic reduction in their production. To bolster our air defense, the Navy assigned about 100 serviceable planes of all types, including Raidens, Zeros, Shidens, Geckos, and Gingas, remodeled night fighters, to Atsugi Air Base. To my disappointment, there were only 15 Zeros at the Meiji Air Base 20 miles southeast of Nagoya, and 30 Zeros at the Naruo Air Base to defend the Osaka and Kobe areas. The Army, on the other hand, stationed in the Tokyo area for both day and night air defense some 200 fighters, including Hayabusas, Shokisi, Hiens, Hayates, Torius, and remodeled Diners. There were in the Nagoya area 80 fighters and 50 planes to defend Osaka and Kobe. During the early stages of the B-29 attacks, our fighters generally proved ineffective against the fast, high-flying, and powerfully armed B-29S. Enemy losses were remarkably low, and the B-29S exacted a stiff toll from our fighters. By the time the B-29S were concentrating their attacks against the aircraft plants, we had greatly improved our air defense system. 3 battle incidents reflect the increased effectiveness of our pilots. On December 3, 1944, our fighters intercepted an estimated 80 B-29S raiding Tokyo, and pilots reported that they had shot down 13 planes and probably destroyed another 7. These losses included 3 B-29S, which were destroyed by Army fighters which rammed the bombers. 2 pilots succeeded in bailing out before the collisions. On the afternoon of December 27th, anti-aircraft guns and fighters were reported to have destroyed 9 out of an estimated 50 bombers, probably destroyed 5 others and damaged 27. On the afternoon of January 27, 1945, fighters and anti-aircraft reputedly accounted for 22 out of 75 B-29S, which raided the Ginza and Hibiya areas in the heart of Tokyo. The majority of Army and Navy officers ridiculed the reports of 22 B-29S destroyed on this date as being impossible. However, on the 29th, we received a wireless report from Zurich, Switzerland, which stated that during the raid in question, the B-29S encountered unexpectedly heavy fighter opposition, and that 30 planes failed to return to their home bases. One plane staggered into its airfield after flying more than 1,600 miles on 2 engines. The losses actually incurred then appeared to exceed our reports of 22 planes destroyed. Post-war investigation revealed that we, as well as Zurich, had greatly overestimated the effects of the fighter planes during this attack. The B-29S bombing Japan were from the Army Air Force's 73rd Wing, and their pilots reported that they had met fighter opposition of unparalleled intensity. The American crews reported that our pilots pressed their attacks right down the formation's stream of fire, dove into formations to attempt rammings, and sprayed fire at random. The American losses for January 27th amounted to 5 bombers destroyed over the target, 2 bombers ditched on the way home, and 33 planes badly shot up. The majority of B-29 attacks had been daylight raids, which gave our fighters the best opportunities to intercept the enemy planes. Lieutenant Teramura, the squadron leader of the 302nd Navy Air Corps at Atsugi, describes the intercept mission on February 4, 1945, over Tokyo. At 28,000 feet, I found a 9-plane formation of B-29S. I flew parallel to the bombers in an attempt to get in front of them, and finally pulled ahead of the enemy planes, which kept up a constant fire at my fighter. I could see only a few tracers which drifted slowly toward me in parabola, and felt little danger. About 3,000 feet ahead of the B-29S, I turned sharply and picked up speed in a shallow dive, dropping below the bombers and then pulling up for the attack. I opened fire against the first B-29 in the formation, attacking from the lower front side of the airplane. As the 2 planes closed rapidly, I did not have the opportunity to maintain a long burst. The nose turrets of 3 B-29S surrounded my fighter with tracers. I opened fire and watched the tracer shells of my 4-cannon converge on the bomber ahead of me. When I was extremely close to the giant bomber, I kicked the right rudder and pushed the control stick forward and to the right, dropping away from the B-29 in a diving turn. My shells had hit, for one of the B-29 engines was burning fiercely. "I got it!" I shouted to myself. One of my pilots, Harukawa, followed my plane and executed the same attack. Taking advantage of our diving speed, we turned and climbed to attack the bombers from below and behind. One of the B-29S dropped out of the formation, trailing a thick plume of white smoke from the outer left engine. Jettisoning its bombs, the airplane took a southeast course toward the Pacific Ocean, steadily losing altitude in an attempt to escape our attack. I continued firing, but soon exhausted my cannon shell supply. Our Raiden fighters, however, were equipped with a single 20mm cannon mounted to the left and behind the pilot's seat, fixed to fire upward at a 30-degree angle. Diving to attack from the right and behind the bomber, I closed the distance between our planes. By this time, Harukawa had expended his ammunition and was returning to base. The enemy gunners kept up a steady defensive fire. I continued to pursue the bomber until I reached the ocean. By then, my fuel was almost gone. When finally I turned to head for home, the B-29 was trailing heavy smoke and descending almost to sea level. I doubted whether it could return to its base. I made an emergency landing at the Konoike Naval Air Base, where the mechanics discovered that enemy bullets had damaged my plane's engine and oil cooler. As was so effectively demonstrated before the war's end, even our most strenuous air defense efforts failed to keep the ever-growing fleets of B-29S from carrying out their missions to destroy our industries and our cities. We reached the height of our air defense measures on the night of May 25th, 26 in 1945, during the Americans' Mission 183 against Tokyo's urban area. Of the 498 planes dispatched for the attack, 464 bombed their primary target over Tokyo. Our fighters and anti-aircraft racked up their greatest single mission total of the air defense period, destroying 26 of the 65-ton airplanes. 100 bombers, 21.3% of the attack force, were shot up by anti-aircraft and fighters. We paid an even heavier price, for the B-29S burned out nearly 19 square miles of the city. By the close of 1944, the Americans actually had committed only a minor portion of their B-29 strength against Japan. No more than 100 B-29S ever bombed their targets on a single operation. In early August of 1945, however, the enemy sent more than 800 of the Great Raiders on a single night's operation over the mainland. This was not the entire picture, of course. In November of 1944, the B-29S carried an average bomb load of 2.6 tons per airplane. In July of 1945, this figure had increased to 7.4 tons. Our best interception and destruction ratio, assisted by anti-aircraft fire, occurred during the month of January 1945, when the enemy lost 5.7% of his attack force. By July of the same year, the Americans enjoyed an unprecedented safety factor for bombing missions, losing only 0.4% of the raiding planes. Greatly responsible for the lowered loss ratio, of course, was the new ability of the B-29S to bomb at any time of the day or night and in almost any weather. In July of 1945, the record month of B-29 attacks, the Americans dropped more than 75% of all their bombs by radar. On the night of March 9th, 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay instituted a new and devastating method of B-29 attack. In every previous attack, night or day, we had never encountered the B-29S below 24,000 feet, and we could expect to meet the airplanes at this height or above. On the night of March 9th, LeMay sent in more than 300 unarmed, stripped-down B-29S to attack Tokyo from an average height of only 7,000 feet. Each of the planes carried from 6 to 8 tons of new jelly gasoline firebombs and swept low over the city in flights which caught our defenses by surprise. The Americans in this daring raid lost 14 bombers, but they also carried out what was then the most destructive air attack in history, burning out more than 16.5 square miles of the city. The enemy pilots reported that Tokyo caught fire like a forest of pine trees. 30 minutes after the attack began, the fires were out of control, fanned by a high ground wind. It was impossible to combat the racing conflagration. As one of our newspapermen reported, the fire clouds kept creeping higher, and the tower of the Diet building stood out black against the red sky. The city was as bright as at sunrise. Clouds of smoke, soot, even sparks driven by the storm flew over it. That night we thought the whole of Tokyo had been reduced to ashes. Estimates of the dead and missing ranged from 80 to 300,000. The final figures will never really be known because of the destruction of vast housing areas and the chaos which followed. In all missions, the great B-29S dropped 157,000 tons of bombs, of which nearly 100,000 tons of incendiaries were directed against 66 target cities, ranging in size from Tokyo to Tsuruga, with a population of 31,000. The Americans burned out more than 170 square miles in these incendiary attacks. It is impossible to determine accurately all the bombing effects because of the terrible state of chaos to which Japan was reduced by August of 1945. More than 30% of our total aircraft industry suffered heavy damage. These attacks, we estimate, denied us the production of more than 7,000 planes annually. We lost 70% of our total output of airplane propellers, which alone was a devastating blow. By the war's end, the bombers had caused a total shutdown, at least temporarily, of our high-grade lubricating oil capacity. While we had a surplus of refining capacity, by August 14, 1945, the B-29S wrecked our 11 most modern refineries. We could hardly assess the overall effect upon our industry merely by adding the total square footage of factory space destroyed. Many plants left standing were useless, denied as they were the materials and parts to work with and suffering from a shortage of labourers who had fled to the hills in terror of future raids. By the end of July, some 90 cities had become literal ash-choked funeral pyres. Only 4 major cities in the country, Kyoto, Hiroshima, Nagasaki and Sapporo, remained undamaged, or had experienced only a few stray bombs. Our industry had been strangled, and even the relatively undamaged plants in Tohoku and Hokkaido stood quiet and unproductive. The machines lay idle because the plants no longer received working materials, and further, because they lacked the means to transport their products to Honshu. The blanketing swarms of carrier-based planes paralysed our communications and all but halted sea transportation between Hokkaido and the mainland. Once the Americans had attended to our larger cities, they went after the small industrial cities in an unbelievably methodical fashion. They concentrated their attacks on cities with less than 100,000 population as their primary targets. An example of these raids, the bomb tonnages of which indicate their terrible effects, follows. Perhaps the overall effect of the bombings against the homeland, an incredible story, is best summarized in the statement of a Tokyo newspaperman. When he was questioned as to B-29 crew reports of damage to Tokyo and other cities which had suffered the most intensive aerial bombardment in history, the reporter replied, "Superfortress reports of damage were not exaggerated. If anything, they constitute the most shocking understatement in the history of aerial warfare. Japan's 4 most critical industrial centers were the areas of Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, and Kita-Kyushu. What happened to these cities is representative of Japan's condition by the time our country surrendered. The 5 largest cities, not including Kita-Kyushu, received nearly half of all bombs dropped by the enemy 20th Air Force. So thoroughly gutted were the major sections of these cities, with a combined total of 103.22 square miles destroyed, that the Americans eliminated them as targets. There is little doubt that the primary reason for the American invasion of tiny Iwo Island, Iwo Jima, was to reduce the loss of B-29s flying against Japan from the Mariana Islands. We knew that the great 4-engined bombers were running into serious trouble on the return flights after attacking the mainland. Dozens of crippled planes, unable to fly the 1,600 miles from Japan to Saipan, were ditched in the open sea. We expected the Americans to make an all-out assault against Iwo Jima, for with the island in their possession, the enemy could land his crippled planes on the 8-mile-long haven. Admiral Ralph A. Ofstie. The reason for the bloody seizure of Iwo Jima was the pressing need to have an additional field for emergency landings. The enemy could also employ Iwo as a springboard for his long-range fighter planes, which escorted the B-29s on their bombing missions. It was only a matter of time, Tokyo reasoned, before the island would be attacked. Further, the attack would undoubtedly involve a preliminary strike elsewhere to draw off our air power. As we had anticipated, the attack came. On February 16, 1945, 3 days before the invasion force assaulted Iwo Jima, American carrier-based planes opened a massive series of air blows against the mainland. A total of 1,000 fighters and bombers swept over military air bases and civilian aircraft factories, chiefly in the Kanto, Tokyo area. The enemy Task Force 58 assembled 16 aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, 17 cruisers, 75 destroyers, and other vessels to support the carrier strikes. The following day, an additional 600 planes returned to batter our targets, dropping in the 2-day period a total of 513 tons of bombs, in addition to the attacks with machine guns, cannon, and rockets. Japanese Imperial General Headquarters announced that our defending fighters and anti-aircraft guns had destroyed at least 275 enemy planes, while we lost only 77 fighters. The American Navy's official combat reports stated otherwise, claiming that their planes had shot down 322 Japanese planes, strafed and damaged 171 on the ground, and had lost 49 to our defences. There is a wide difference in these two reports, as seems to have been the case throughout the war. Certainly our claims appeared to be as widely exaggerated as were the Americans. We never did ascertain all the losses, due to the chaotic condition of our communications and chain of command at the time. In my opinion, as a responsible officer of Japanese naval headquarters, the actual losses of both combatants appeared to have been approximately the losses each opposing force announced. That is, Japanese losses probably amounted to 77 planes, and American losses to 49 planes. One cannot, however, contest the fact that the attack of the 16th was a complete surprise to our homeland defences. Tokyo expected the carrier assault, but not directly against the heart of the homeland. Consequently, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters overwhelmed our Army and Navy fighter planes, both numerically and qualitatively. Our fighters fought a difficult defensive battle against overwhelming odds and against planes which brazenly swept low against every possible ground target. There was one especially bright note which served to overcome the general oppression of an overwhelming enemy success. There was no doubt that the Americans had achieved their original objective, and that our battered air force could do little to halt further mass carrier raids. The majority of our pilots were inexperienced, and consequently were at a decided disadvantage against the Hellcat pilots. However, Flight Warrant Officer Kinsuke Muto of the Yokosuka Navy Air Corps put up a brilliant single-handed defense against tremendous odds. About noon of the first day the enemy planes attacked, fighter plane pilots awaiting orders at Atsugi Navy Air Base sighted a single Shiden mod. Fighter fleeing southward over Yokohama and pursued by 12 Hellcat fighters. There could be only one outcome to the chase, and the pilots waited for the Shiden fighter to fall in flames. However, the unexpected happened. As the Hellcats closed the distance between their groups and the Shiden, the Japanese fighter suddenly turned sharply and at full speed raced directly at the enemy planes. The Hellcats' formations scattered before the unexpected maneuver, and the 13 fighters swung into a wild melee of twisting and turning airplanes. Taking advantage of the fact that, in a battle of 12 planes against one, the enemy force often gets in its own way, Muto hung onto the tail of a Hellcat, pouring cannon shells into the Grumman until it blew apart. The remaining 11 Hellcat pilots frantically tried to latch on to the elusive Shiden, and their tracers could be seen filling the air about the agile Japanese fighter. Muto saw his opportunity, turned directly into one of the Grummans, and pressed the head-on attack. His cannon shells shattered the plane, and the pilot bailed out. By now, Muto played what was obviously his superior flying skill to the hilt. Abandoning his defensive maneuvers, he became the attacker, and in short order 2 more Grummans plunged from the sky. 4 down. The remaining 8 Hellcat fighters abruptly broke off the engagement and fled the area. The incredible battle ended, and a tired but jubilant Kinsuke Muto brought his fighter, riddled with enemy bullets, to a safe landing at Yokosuka Air Base. Pilots watching from Atsugi did not know the name of the pilot in the Shiden fighter, but after watching the Grummans being shot out of the sky, they quickly identified him as Muto. This was only natural. Muto was famous as one of the leading Navy aces. He shot his first enemy plane out of the air at least 8 years before this battle, as a fighter pilot flying in China in 1937. Muto was assigned to the Yokosuka Navy Air Corps as a combat test pilot, and on February 16th had taken one of the new Shiden mod, fighters up on a test flight against enemy fighters. He left his base and circled about the Tokyo area in a search for enemy planes. Failing to meet the expected American fighters, he turned to return to Yokosuka when he noticed the 12 Hellcats diving upon his fighter. On February 17th, the enemy carrier planes made 2 heavy attacks against the Tokyo area, one morning and one afternoon raid. The Americans flew almost unopposed against their objectives, and the majority of the fighters and bombers machine-gunned, rocketed, and bombed their targets with little opposition. Again, the only bright spot of the day was that relating to a single fighter pilot, this time Lieutenant J.G. Sadanori Akamatsu, the Navy's senior fighter pilot ace. Flying a Zero fighter from Atsugi, Akamatsu shot down 2 Hellcats over Tokyo Bay. When the enemy planes returned for their second attack, Akamatsu intercepted 2 Grummons directly over the Atsugi field and shot both planes out of the air for a one-day tally of 4 enemy fighters destroyed. When flown by thoroughly experienced pilots like Muto and Akamatsu, the Zero could prove a formidable opponent even against the versatile Hellcat. However, the greater majority of our fighter pilots were green youngsters with little or no combat experience. In their hands, the Zero was no match for the Grumman fighter. There existed no doubt in our minds that we had long since lost qualitative superiority to the Americans. Our mainland air defense force, fully occupied with interception of the increasing B-29 attacks, lost all power to cope with the enemy carrier raids. Our defending fighter force could well be described as completely helpless. This situation arose in great part from the fact that Japan lacked a single operational fighter plane which could match the Hellcat fighter, and stood little chance of seeing its prototype planes manufactured in sufficient quantity to improve our situation. Without superior defending fighter planes, our mainland air defense force was virtually useless. We could throw our dwindling reserves against the B-29S and the carrier attacks, shoot down some planes, and still in no way diminish the severity of the enemy air blows. Whatever number of planes we could destroy would not cause the enemy to slacken his efforts to pound Japan into absolute submission. By the spring of 1945, the B-29 attacks reached catastrophic proportions, and the great bombers thundered over our cities in furious day and night assaults. We could do relatively little against these systematic and large-scale bombardments, for we had never built a satisfactory high-altitude fighter plane. The Americans caused unimaginable havoc, especially when bad weather grounded our planes. Our fighters sat impotent on their runways, while the hundreds of B-29S roared overhead, using their radar bomb sights to smash with uncanny accuracy at our factories and cities. The price the Americans paid for Iwo Jima was high: 4,800 dead, 15,800 wounded, and 400 missing. The tiny island, however, paid handsome dividends. From March 4th, when the first crippled B-29 landed on the still-crewed runway, to the war's end, a total 2,251 superfortresses made emergency landings. The crew members in these airplanes, most of which never could have returned to Saipan or Guam, amounted to 24,761 men. In the bitter defense of Iwo, we lost 22,322 men killed. When the Iwo conflict ended on March 13th, our losses in patrol boats in the Southern Sea rose to alarming figures. Enemy planes scoured the ocean in search of our patrol vessels and made these small ships their special targets. Soon we could no longer count on the survival of a single patrol boat in the area, and were forced to rely for warning of enemy attacks entirely upon the radar reports of our southern island outposts. Under these conditions, we were wide open to attack at any time by powerful enemy carrier forces. As we expected, the carrier planes returned. Between March 18th and 21, the enemy fighters and bombers swept almost at will over the mainland, pouring their shells, rockets, and bombs into every conceivable target. Not even the remotest areas of Japan were safe from the marauding planes. At this time, the Navy's 343rd Air Corps, considered the most powerful fighter plane unit of the entire Army and Navy, was stationed at the Matsuyama Air Base in Shikoku. Equipped mostly with the newer Shiden fighters, the plane which had become the Navy's great hope for a carrier-based fighter, the 343rd was manned by outstanding Navy fighter pilots, all of whom had considerable combat experience. The commander was Captain Minoru Genda, an able and experienced leader who had made the preliminary draft for the Pearl Harbor attack and who had served as an air staff officer of Imperial General Headquarters for the preceding year. On March 18th and 19, the enemy carrier planes raided the Kure naval base. They met completely unexpected opposition from Genda's pilots. Combining extensive air combat experience with a fighter plane which featured a maximum speed exceeding 400 miles per hour and effective armor plating, they caused heavy losses to those planes they encountered. This constituted the only decisive victory of all the Japanese fighter plane units against the American carrier plane attacks. Tokyo announced that for the 2 days of fighting in the Kure area, our land, sea and air defences destroyed 119 planes, and that the majority fell victim to the 343rd Air Corps. Again, we at Naval Headquarters could not determine the actual number of enemy planes destroyed, but obviously Gender's men provided effective opposition.